Blood. That was what I still felt on my hands when I crossed the border of Egypt for the last time as a prince. Egyptian blood. The blood that would seal the fate of 2 nations and unleash the most devastating wrath the world had ever witnessed. I am Moses, and what you are about to see forever changed the course of human history. This is the story of when the unseen God of slaves broke the chains of a forgotten people and humbled the most powerful empire on earth. The blood was still fresh on my hands when I fled across the Egyptian frontier. It was the blood of that taskmaster, the one who was beating my Hebrew brother nearly to death. A single blow had been enough to silence him forever, but it wasn't enough to silence the echo of that moment, which now haunted me across the unforgiving desert. Every grain of sand the wind threw in my face seemed to whisper, "Murderer, fugitive, failure." Pharaoh wanted me dead. The man who had known me since I was a child, who had watched me grow up in the corridors of his palace, had now put a price on my head. 40 years of privilege had unraveled in a single, furious moment. And there I was, the Prince of Egypt, now a thirsty nomad, carrying nothing but the clothes on my back and the crushing weight of a purpose I did not yet understand. Memories haunted me as I walked. I saw myself again as that baby in the reed basket, floating on the waters of the Nile, while my true mother watched from a distance, her heart broken by the need to abandon me to save me. Pharaoh's decree echoed in my mind. Every Hebrew boy must die. But someone, had stopped me from becoming just another victim of that systematic genocide. It was Pharaoh's daughter, that compassionate princess who found me crying among the reeds and decided to defy her own father by adopting me. She gave me a name, an identity, a future, Moses, drawn from the water. I never imagined how prophetic that name would be, nor how many more waters I would yet cross, divide, and transform. I grew up as Egyptian royalty. I learned their languages, their customs, their wisdom. I had access to the best tutors, the vastest libraries, the most guarded state secrets. But I always knew I was different. I always felt the call of the blood that ran in my veins. While other princes concerned themselves with banquets and hunts, I would watch from the palace windows as the Hebrew slaves hauled stones under the scorching Sunday. I saw their bodies bent by forced labor, their backs scarred by the whip, their eyes devoid of hope, and something inside me rebelled. How many times did I try to intervene discreetly? How many times did I use my position to ease the suffering of a few? But they were mere drops in an ocean of oppression. The system was immense, relentless, fueled by the greed of a nation that had built its glory on the bones of the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The first time I visited the construction sites, I felt something I couldn't name. It was as if a silent voice was whispering in my ear, "These are your brothers. Not brothers of the palace, but brothers of blood, of lineage, of destiny." There I stood, wearing fine linen and gold jewelry, while they barely had rags to cover their wounded bodies. And then came that day, the day that changed everything. I saw the Egyptian taskmaster brutally whipping an elderly Hebrew who had stumbled with his load. The man screamed for mercy, but the whip kept falling. I looked around, no one else was there. That's when the fury took hold of me. A fury that came from a place deeper than my Egyptian upbringing, older than my life in the palace. It was as if 400 years of oppression exploded through my fists. The blow was precise, deadly. The taskmaster collapsed like a sack of grain, and I stood there, breathless, contemplating what I had done. I buried his body in the sand, but I couldn't bury the truth. I had crossed a line from which there was no return. I was no longer an Egyptian prince observing from afar. I was an Israelite who had shed blood for his people. The next day, when I tried to intervene in a fight between 2 Hebrews, one of them shot back with words that cut deeper than any blade. "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" My secret was out. There was no going back. The forced exile in the desert wasn't just an escape, it was a stripping away. Every step took me further, not only from Egypt, but from the person I thought I was. Prince Moses died in those sands. What survived was something new, still undefined, molded by the merciless sun and absolute solitude. 40 years of certainty dissolved into a long journey toward the unknown. When I finally saw the tents of Midian on the horizon, I was no longer the man who had left Egypt. I was a refugee, a shepherd in training, someone who needed to learn to listen to the silence of the desert, so that one day, perhaps, I could hear the voice that would change not only my life, but the destiny of 2 entire nations. What I didn't know was that my true journey was just beginning. 40 years, 4 entire decades, herding sheep in the arid mountains of Midian had transformed the 40-year-old fugitive prince into an 80-year-old man, weathered by the desert. My hands, once soft from Egyptian luxury, were now calloused by a shepherd's staff. My face, tanned by the relentless sun, bore wrinkles that told stories of solitude and reflection. Jethro, my father-in-law, had welcomed me as a son, and his daughter, Zipporah, had given me 2 sons of my own, who ran through the rocky fields like wild goats. The simple life had brought me a measure of peace. I would wake before dawn, lead the flock through scarce pastures, and return at sunset. There were no more politics, no conspiracies, no heavy responsibilities. I was just Moses, the shepherd. I liked to believe I had found my final peace, far from the turmoil of the civilized world. But the past never truly leaves us. In the silent nights of the desert, when the wind whispered among the rocks, I could still hear the groans of the Hebrew slaves echoing across the decades. I saw their pleading faces, their bent bodies, their tears mixed with sweat under the scorching Egyptian Sunday, and one question tormented me constantly. Where was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Why did he remain silent while his people suffered? That morning began like any other. I was leading Jethro's flock to the slopes of Mount Horeb, following a trail I knew by heart. The sun was still low when I noticed something strange in the distance, a light that danced among the dry bushes. I thought it was just the reflection of the morning sun on the rocks, but the light remained constant, pulsating, alive. I approached with curiosity. It was an ordinary bush, typical of that region, but it was completely engulfed in flames that did not consume it. The flames rose and fell in a hypnotic rhythm, yet every leaf remained intact. Every branch held its original shape. It was impossible. It defied every law of nature I knew. I stopped at a safe distance, both fascinated and terrified. 40 years in the desert had taught me to respect the inexplicable, but this transcended any natural phenomenon I had ever witnessed. The fire produced no smoke, made no crackling sound, and radiated a presence that made every fiber of my being vibrate with an instinctive reverence. It was then that the voice echoed from the midst of the flames. Moses, Moses. It didn't come from the sky or the earth, but from the very center of the burning bush. Hearing my name repeated, I knew at once it was not a human voice. It carried an authority that made my soul tremble, a purity that exposed every sin, every failure, every moment of cowardice I carried. Instinctively, I answered, "Here I am." Then the voice warned me not to come any closer, and commanded me to take the sandals off my feet, for the place where I was standing was holy ground. I removed my sandals with trembling hands, each movement an instinctive bow before the impossible. The ground beneath my bare feet radiated a holiness that penetrated my very being. It was like standing in the presence of the source of life itself. He then revealed himself, saying, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." I immediately covered my face, not from fear of death, but from the recognition that no man could look upon such glory and live. The revelation that followed shattered me. He was the God of my ancestors, and he had come down to deliver his people from Egyptian oppression. The cry of the children of Israel had reached him, and now, of all people, I was to be his instrument of liberation. My first reaction was sheer terror, followed by absolute denial. Me, an 80-year-old fugitive who struggled to speak fluently, a man who had failed as a leader in his youth and now lived as a simple shepherd? How could I return to Egypt and confront the most fearsome power on earth? I tried to argue, to protest, to find any excuse that would free me from this impossible mission. I spoke of my lack of eloquence, of the fact that the Hebrew people themselves might not accept me after 40 years. But every objection was met with a promise. Every fear was confronted with a guarantee of divine power. He showed me signs that defied reason. My shepherd's staff turned into a serpent that made me recoil in panic, then returned to its original form when I grasped it again. My hand became leprous when I placed it inside my cloak, and was then completely healed when I repeated the gesture. These were demonstrations of a power I couldn't have imagined. But the moment that changed everything was when he revealed his name. I am who I am. It wasn't just a name, it was a declaration of absolute existence, of eternity, of limitless power. It was the answer to all my questions about his apparent absence during centuries of suffering. He had never left. He had been there all along, waiting for the precise moment to act. The responsibility that fell upon my shoulders in that instant was overwhelming. I was no longer just an anonymous shepherd in the desert of Midian. I was the one chosen to return to the most powerful empire on earth and demand the release of 600,000 enslaved people. I was the spokesman for the invisible God before pharaohs who considered themselves deities. When the divine presence withdrew and the fire went out, I remained there for hours, trying to process what had happened. My simple, peaceful life was over. Ahead lay a journey that would test every fiber of my faith, that would bring me face to face with painful memories and lost friendships. The shepherd Moses was dead. Now, walking among the sheep was the Liberator of Israel, carrying a burden that only faith could make bearable. Returning to Egypt after 40 years of exile was like rising from the dead. Every familiar stone, every majestic column, every hieroglyph carved into the walls transported me back to my youth, when I ran through the palace corridors as a carefree prince. But now, I walked as a stranger in my own homeland, carrying a shepherd's staff and a mission that would challenge the most powerful empire in the known world. Aaron was waiting for me on the outskirts of the city, just as had been promised. My older brother, now 83, still had the eloquence I never possessed. His eyes filled with tears when he saw me approach. I was no longer the young prince who had fled, but an old man marked by the desert, my hair and beard whitened by the relentless Midian Sunday. Together, we first went to the elders of the children of Israel. We found a broken people, bent by generations of slavery that had intensified drastically since my departure. Their backs were maps of scars left by Egyptian whips. Their eyes reflected a deep resignation that cut me to the soul. When Aaron proclaimed the words I had taught him and performed the signs before them, something extraordinary happened. The staff that turned into a serpent drew exclamations of astonishment and reverence. My hand, which became instantly leprous, made them fall to their knees. But it was when I poured water from the Nile onto the dry ground, and it turned to blood, that the silence became absolute. These were unmistakable signs of divine power, and that suffering people immediately recognized the hand of the God of their fathers moving on their behalf. For the first time in centuries, the children of Israel bowed down and worshipped. But convincing my own people was only the first step. Ahead lay the true challenge, confronting the man who had once been my playmate, my adopted brother, my confidant in the secrets of the palace. The new Pharaoh was not the one who had raised me. He had died decades ago. This was his descendant, but he carried the same divine arrogance, the same absolute conviction that he was a God incarnate. The throne room was exactly as I remembered it. When my name was announced, a murmur went through the court. Moses, the fugitive prince, had returned. Pharaoh watched me for long moments before speaking. His eyes held a complex mixture of curiosity, contempt, and something that could be interpreted as a shadow of lost affection. My request echoed through the hall like distant thunder. Let the people of Israel go, that they may hold a feast to their God in the desert. Simple words, but they carried the weight of 400 years of captivity. Pharaoh's response was predictable, yet sharp. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice?" he scoffed. Why should he bow to an invisible deity of an enslaved people? I demonstrated the signs I had been given, but the court magicians reproduced them with their dark arts. My staff became a serpent, but so did theirs. The difference was that my serpent devoured theirs, a grim omen of what was to come. But Pharaoh's heart hardened. His final words were a sentence. Not only did he deny our request, but he would intensify the oppression. If the Israelites had time to think about worship, it meant they weren't working hard enough. From that moment on, they would have to produce the same quota of bricks, but without being given straw. They would have to find it themselves. I left the palace carrying not only rejection, but also the responsibility for my people's intensified suffering. The Hebrews, who had initially welcomed me with hope, now blamed me for their worsening situation. That night, alone under the stars, I cried out to the Almighty. Why had He allowed this? The answer I received changed my perspective completely. This was just the beginning. Pharaoh would come to know the name of the Lord through acts that would shake the very foundations of his civilization. Every refusal would only harden his heart further, preparing him for judgments that would reveal who truly ruled over the earth and the heavens. The confrontation was just beginning, and the sacred waters of the Nile would soon witness the first act in a war between gods. The next morning, I went to the Nile as Pharaoh performed his daily worship to the river god. Aaron stood beside me, holding the staff. When I proclaimed the demand for liberation once more, Pharaoh's response was a scornful laugh. His magicians stood ready. I raised the staff over the crystal-clear waters of the Nile. For an instant, everything was suspended. Then, as if an invisible force had poured red dye from the heavenly throne itself, the transformation began. It was instantaneous, absolute, terrifying. The clear waters turned to blood red in seconds. A metallic, nauseating odor filled the air. Fish began to die immediately, their silver scales a grotesque contrast to the viscous red that was now their liquid tomb. The Nile, the source of all life in Egypt, had become a river of death. The court magicians desperately tried to reproduce the phenomenon. They took clean water from a jar and turned it into blood with their enchantments. But it was a pathetic trick compared to the magnitude of what had happened to the entire river. The impact was devastating. For 7 days, Egypt lived this unbearable reality. For 7 days, they breathed the constant stench of aquatic death, realizing their millennial gods could not restore a single drop of clean water. This first plague set a pattern. Each plague would directly attack a specific Egyptian deity, revealing its impotence before the true sovereign of the universe. Pharaoh, however, remained defiant. 7 days of blood passed before the Nile finally returned to normal. But the false sense of relief was short-lived. The second encounter took place at the same sacred spot. When I stretched the staff over the restored waters, the response was immediate and deafening. A sound began as a distant murmur, then intensified into a deafening chorus. Millions of frogs emerged simultaneously from the river's depths, covering its surface in a green, hopping mass. But the real horror began when they left the water. They invaded relentlessly, marching in successive waves toward the cities and towns. They entered homes through the smallest cracks, climbed walls, leaped through windows. Families awoke in the night to feel something cold and damp hopping on their bodies. Kitchens became impossible battlegrounds as frogs leaped into boiling pots and ovens. Even the sacred temples were desecrated. The magicians managed to summon a few more frogs with their dark arts, but it only added to the chaos. For the first time, Pharaoh begged for my intercession. He promised to release the Hebrews if I made the frogs disappear. I prayed, and at the exact time I had promised, every frog died simultaneously. The silence was deafening, but it brought a new horror. Millions of rotting corpses. The stench of decomposition was unbearable. The Egyptians gathered the carcasses into huge mounds that dotted the landscape. But as soon as the air cleared, Pharaoh's heart hardened once more. The promise was forgotten. The pattern was now brutally clear. The next plague came without warning. Aaron stretched out the staff and struck the dust of the earth. Immediately, every speck of dust throughout Egypt transformed into gnats. It wasn't a gradual infestation. It was an instantaneous metamorphosis that turned the very ground into a sea of hungry parasites. There was no escape. They swarmed over people and animals, their bites causing an uncontrollable, torturous itch. People scratched themselves until they bled. The court magicians, who had managed to imitate the first two signs, were utterly powerless. For the first time, they confessed to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But even the testimony of his own spiritual advisors could not soften Pharaoh's heart. He simply ignored the evidence and clung to his divine pride. The fourth plague brought a devastating escalation, but also revealed a profound truth about divine protection. For the first time, there would be a clear, visible separation between the land inhabited by the Israelites and the rest of Egypt. Swarms of flies descended like dense black clouds, blocking out the sunday. These were not ordinary flies. They were voracious, aggressive creatures that bit fiercely. The air became unbreathable due to the density of the swarms. Yet, while all of Egypt suffered, the land of Goshen remained completely untouched. It was as if an invisible, absolute barrier protected the Hebrew territory. Egyptians who fled to Goshen discovered that the flies simply could not cross that spiritual border. This supernatural separation forced even the most skeptical to acknowledge they were dealing with a direct divine intervention. Pharaoh, pressured by his court, again promised freedom. And again, once I prayed and the flies vanished, his heart hardened and the promise was broken. The next attack struck at the heart of the Egyptian economy, destroying the source of its agricultural wealth. The fifth plague came as an invisible pestilence that spread with the speed of the wind. At dawn, Egyptian shepherds went out to their flocks and found a scene of utter devastation. Every horse, donkey, camel, and head of cattle lay dead in the fields. A disease with no visible marks had exterminated all of their livestock overnight. The economic ruin was instantaneous, but the most stunning aspect was the supernatural protection over the livestock of Israel. While every Egyptian animal died, every Hebrew sheep, goat, and ox in Goshen remained perfectly healthy. It was a separation so absolute it defied any natural explanation. Pharaoh sent investigators to confirm the reports. They came back with the impossible truth. Not a single Hebrew animal had been touched. Even with this overwhelming evidence, even as the sacred bull of Apis lay dead with the common cattle, Pharaoh's heart remained like stone. The sixth plague brought the suffering directly to the bodies of the oppressors. I took ashes from a furnace, a symbol of the forced labor of the Hebrews, and threw them into the air before Pharaoh. The ash spread as a fine dust over Egypt, and the effect was immediate and agonizing. Festering boils erupted on the skin of every Egyptian, from the most refined nobles to the humblest workers. These were deep, painful sores that caused constant, unbearable pain. The court magicians were so severely afflicted they couldn't even stand before Pharaoh. A complete humiliation for the intermediaries of the Egyptian gods. And once again, the children of Israel were completely protected. Not a single boil appeared on any Hebrew. The differentiation was so stark, it was impossible to deny the supernatural shield over God's chosen people. Pharaoh, even with his own body covered in painful boils, maintained his stubborn rebellion. The heavens themselves now became instruments of divine wrath. The seventh plague brought a storm that defied nature. I stretched my staff toward the sky, and black clouds instantly swallowed the Sunday. Day turned into an artificial night, charged with palpable tension. Then, the hail began. These were not ordinary hailstones. They were massive projectiles of ice, some the size of a fist, that descended with destructive force. What made the storm even more terrifying was the fire mixed with the ice. Constant lightning struck the ground, and fire spread, burning everything it touched. It was an impossible contradiction, fire and ice falling from the sky in a dance of devastation. Trees were shattered, homes caught fire, and the crops that had survived the earlier plagues were annihilated. Men and animals caught outdoors were killed instantly. Yet again, the land of Goshen remained under a clear and serene sky. One could literally see the line where judgment ended and protection began. The storm finally ceased, revealing an unrecognizable Egypt. For the first time, some of Pharaoh's officials openly questioned his wisdom, begging him to let the Israelites go before everything was destroyed. But the royal heart remained petrified. The eighth plague arrived as an organized army from the horizon. A distant dark cloud revealed itself to be an invasion of locusts on a scale that defied imagination. They descended and covered every available surface, turning the ground into a living, hungry carpet. The devastation was absolute. They devoured everything that had grown back after the hailstorm, even the bark on the trees. In a matter of days, they turned Egypt into a barren wasteland. The nation was literally starving. Desperate officials again pleaded with Pharaoh. He called for me and Aaron, offering a partial release. The men could go, but the women and children must stay. I refused. The divine demand was for total liberation. Only when Pharaoh begged specifically for the removal of this plague, again promising full release, did I pray. A powerful wind swept the locusts into the Red Sea, and just as before, once relief came, Pharaoh's heart hardened, and the promise was broken. The ninth plague was an assault on the collective psyche of a civilization that worshipped the sun god, Ra. I stretched my hand toward the heavens, and a supernatural darkness descended over all of Egypt. It was not the gradual dimming of an eclipse. It was the sudden, complete extinction of all light. This was a darkness that transcended nature. It was dense, palpable, oppressive. Egyptians held their hands in front of their faces, and couldn't see their own fingers. The psychological terror was devastating. Ra, the supreme deity, was completely nullified. For 3 consecutive days, Egypt was paralyzed in this tangible darkness. People stumbled in their own homes, unable to move. Those who tried to light torches found the flames were instantly swallowed by the blackness. And yet, in the dwellings of the children of Israel in Goshen, there was light. It was possible for an Egyptian to stand at the border, reach his hand across the invisible line, and see it illuminated by the light-bathing Goshen, while the rest of his body remained plunged in oppressive darkness. On the 3rd day, when the darkness finally lifted, the relief was so intense that many Egyptians fell to their knees weeping. Pharaoh summoned me once more, his voice filled with exhaustion. He offered a greater concession. All the people could go, but the flocks and herds must stay. I refused. Liberation had to be complete. His final response was a death sentence. "Never see my face again," he warned, "for on the day you see my face, you shall die." My reply was somber and prophetic. He was right. He would never see my face again. But there would be one final plague, so devastating that Pharaoh himself would not just permit our departure, but would drive us out of Egypt. The 10th plague would not be like the others. It would be a sharp blade, cutting directly into the heart of every Egyptian family, taking what was most precious. It was the final judgment. Before that fateful midnight, I had to prepare my own people for a ritual that would shield them, the Passover. Each Hebrew family was to select a perfect lamb, and on the 14th day of the month, they were to sacrifice it and apply its blood to the doorposts and lintel of their homes. It was a visible sign for the destroyer who would pass through Egypt that night. I watched my people perform this ritual with solemnity and sacred terror. They ate the roasted lamb with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, standing, dressed, and ready to leave at a moment's notice. As midnight approached, a supernatural tension settled over Egypt. Then, in terrifying, impossible unison, a wail began. Echoing across the land a collective groan of despair. In every Egyptian home, from the royal palace to the humblest hut, the firstborn son had died instantly. It didn't matter their age. The Pharaoh's own son, heir to the throne, lay lifeless in his golden bed. The death was silent, with no signs of violence. It was as if their souls had been summoned at the same exact moment. The lament that rose from Egypt was the sound of a future being brutally ripped from the present. Even the firstborn of the livestock died that night. Throughout that horror, not a single Hebrew home was touched. The blood on the doorposts had done its work. The dawn revealed a broken civilization. Pharaoh, a shattered father who had lost his own heir, sent for me with desperate urgency. "Leave at once," he pleaded. "Take everything that is yours, even your flocks, but go before we all die." It was the complete surrender of a man who had learned too late that some battles cannot be won. For the first time in 400 years, the children of Israel were no longer slaves. They were free. The morning after the most terrible night in Egyptian history brought something no Hebrew had experienced in 4 centuries. True freedom. The transformation was surreal. The very guards who had whipped us now escorted us respectfully to the borders of their cities. Egyptians, their families broken by the loss of their firstborn, approached us, not with hatred, but with a reverent terror. They pressed upon us their most precious jewels, their gold and silver, their finest clothes. It wasn't charity, it was a desperate tribute to hasten our departure. Families who had left their homes with nothing suddenly found themselves rich with the treasures of Egypt. A nation of 600,000 men, plus women and children, and a mixed multitude of others who joined us, began the march out of Egypt. It was an entire nation on the move, carrying the hopes of 4 centuries. We left from Ramesses, and the sun seemed to shine down on us like a victorious army. The silence of our departure was eloquent. There were no wild shouts of joy, but a deep, collective recognition that we were living a moment that would echo for all time. We carried the bones of Joseph with us, fulfilling an ancient promise. Our journey was not just physical, but spiritual. We were reconnecting with our roots. God led us not by the most direct route through the land of the Philistines, for the people were not yet ready for war. Instead, He guided us toward the desert. Each mile put more distance between us and 400 years of captivity. As the sun set on our first day of freedom, We made camp. Fires dotted the landscape like earthbound stars, each one representing a family sleeping free for the first time in generations. But even in the midst of celebration, a shadow lingered in my mind. I knew the human heart. I knew that the same Pharaoh who had driven us out in terror could easily reconsider when he realized the economic catastrophe our departure represented. Our journey to true freedom was only just beginning. Behind us lay a broken but still powerful empire. Ahead lay an immense and merciless desert. And before we reached the holy mountain where we would receive the law, we would face one final demonstration of the power that had set us free. The waters themselves would part, and our liberty would be sealed forever in the depths of a sea that would become a tomb for our pursuers. Only then, singing victory on the shores of final redemption, would our journey to the promised land truly begin.